Hi class, I hope you enjoy this presentation. This is going to be a general overview of the history of photography. So I'm going to touch quickly on the beginnings of it to present day. And then throughout the semester, we're going to go in much deeper and talk about all these photographs, all these different processes more in depth. But this is just to get an idea of where we started to where we are today. So enjoy the presentation. What is the meaning of the word photography? The term comes from the Greek word phos, which means light, and graphos, which means writing or drawing. So therefore, it's the practice of creating durable images by recording light. So the word photography means writing with light, but most photographers claim they're painting with light. This writing with light, or painting with light, was first termed by Sir John Herschel to William Henry Fox Talbot. We'll talk about these two in a few minutes. They wrote a letter back and forth, and Herschel was an English astronomer. He devised the words negative and positive. And he also came up with the word snapshot. A lot of his work involved chemistry, which was the forerunner of the black and white processes. Henry Fox Talbot was the inventor of the negative-positive process of photography. And he was an English chemist, mathematician, linguist, and archaeologist. People have been keeping visual records of themselves and the things around them since prehistoric times, recording images that range from carefully drawn hieroglyphics to pictures taken on the surface of the moon. Each image is an attempt to communicate from one person to another the things that we see. Now here we see a photo by Hoot Gibson. Now Hoot Gibson is an astronaut who was also a Suffolk County Community College alumni. And he is very well known for his missions to the moon and for some of these photographs. Now this photograph, along with some other ones, had made it into Life magazine. So now if we go back 40,000 years ago, Paleolithic times, the discovery of images projected inside caves and tents. This is what they were doing. They were using small holes and projections for rituals and artistic practices. Now these small holes enabled light on the other side of the cave and tent to project an image on the darker side, on the tent side, on the cave side. So fast forward to Aristotle in 300 BC. What he did was, instead of looking directly at an eclipsed sun, which could damage your eyes, the Greek philosopher Aristotle observed a crescent shape projected onto the ground. He noted that sunlight traveling through small openings between, let's say, between the leaves of a tree, the openings of a piece of wicker, or even interlaced fingers will create circular patterns of light onto the ground. Now here we see a more modern picture of this. This is shadows during a solar eclipse made in 1994. The technique that photography originated from dates back to the early to mid 1400s. It started from the camera's predecessor, the camera obscura, which actually means dark room in Latin. It was a box with a pinhole in the front and a glass screen at the opposite end. And when light shone through the pinhole, it formed an image onto the glass. So who would find that camera obscura useful? Actually, many artists of the time. So when viewing the screen of the obscura, an artist could trace the scene that was being projected onto it. It kind of took some of the legwork out of drawing a scene. And later on, a lens is going to be added to the camera because it made it sharper. They got a sharper line drawing out of it. Many known artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Rembrandt, Johannes Vermeer, they all used the camera obscura to help them paint some of their most famous artworks. German astronomer Johannes Kepler also uses a camera obscura. He alters it to a portable tent in 1604 instead of a large room. So here we see a little illustration of what it would look kind of like. Now the obscura is above him, which lets the amount of light in, and the person just sitting there is drawing the reflection of the light, the image projected onto the paper. German author Johann Sohn publishes a book which contains the first detailed drawings and diagrams of the reflex box camera obscura, which is the first kind of box camera, small and portable. And here we see an illustration of it. And yet another illustration of another camera obscura device. Sir Robert Hooke suggests a wearable camera obscura in this image. He calls it a picture box. So he can hold it above him and draw the image that is coming through the pinhole. So here are some artists that use the camera obscura, who we thoroughly believe used the camera obscura. Here's Johannes Vermeer, and he's a Dutch painter. He specialized in like domestic scenes of middle-class life. But he had photorealistic attention to detail. And it's been questioned because he had no formal training in art, and he didn't create any pre-sketches of his paintings and drawings. And in order to get the preciseness that we're going to see in the next couple slides, he would have had to use some sort of device to trace from. Now this image right here is a very popular painting of him, Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring. I'm sure you've seen it before. So there's little highlights that critics kind of hint at. It's a reflection from a primitive lens on a camera obscura. That's what they think it is. It's obviously not a flash. People have said maybe it's just window light, but we're not 100% sure. Here we have a couple paintings by Vermeer that kind of hint at that he used a camera obscura. He has elongated perspectives in these two paintings. We can see that in the floor tiles that are receding backwards, the perspective of them. It's really elongated. It's like you're looking through a camera lens, especially with the trained eye. So now the question is, could there be a way to record the images that are appearing through that camera obscura besides just drawing or painting from them? A camera obscura that we've been talking about is an optical device, right? It was the predecessor to what photography has become and the photographer's camera. The device, that square box or the room that is projecting light through a pinhole, strikes a surface on the opposite side of the wall or the box that is being used. It's going to be upside down, the image, because of that small little hole, that small little aperture. So for people who are not photographers, each lens that a photographer uses has different apertures. Those are openings that are letting light into the camera. So now let's look at the oldest surviving photograph. This is by Joseph Nicephore Nitzsche in 1826, 1827. So it's a view from his window of his house, and it's the oldest surviving photograph. So when we researched Nietzsche's notes, it shows that this exposure most likely took days to make because of this heliographic emulsion. Now, this heliographic emulsion wasn't so light sensitive. Now, this emulsion is a light sensitive formulation mixed with oil that is applied as a thin coating on a polished pewter plate. Now, when you put this plate into the back of the camera obscura, the opposite side of where that pinhole is shining light through, and position it near a window, after that several days of exposure, you'll see an impression of what's outside. So you see here a courtyard, you see trees, buildings. Here we can see the actual heliograph plate, the metal plate that the picture was imprinted on. Now you can see this, it's on display in a Texas museum. It's in a very light sensitive case. So it's in a shaded area of the museum. It's in a case that has no oxygen in it because we want to preserve this image as best we can. As you can see, it's really faint. So we go from making a picture onto a piece of metal to producing a picture onto a piece of paper. And now we get there with this gentleman, William Henry Fox Talbot, in 1835. He developed a photogenic drawing, what he called, process on paper with a chemical silver chloride. It took about an hour or so to create an exposure. And it's a chemically stabilized photograph, so they can now be viewed in straight light. It's going to be permanently fixed onto the paper. And we're going to talk more about him and his contemporary Daguerre in the next presentation next week. So we'll briefly talk about Talbot in this slide here. He is the inventor of the negative positive process, and in about 1840. So a negative positive process means you produce a negative, whether that negative is on a cellulose, like those soft films that we used to use before digital, or onto a piece of glass. The image is negatively reversed. So whatever is light of the image, like the sun, is going to look dark on the negative. Now, the great thing about a negative is you can make many positives from it. Now, using paper or other things coated with a chemical, you can put that negative on top of it and expose it to more sunlight, which makes a positive, the opposite. So he had used, it's called a calotype. It's a treated paper, so a chemical was coated onto a paper, and that was the first negative he used. He put it on the opposite side of the camera obscura, the light shone on it, it created a negative. Now the image was invisible until it was developed with chemicals. And then that positive print was made from that negative. So in the 1800s, photographs of people, portraits, were becoming so incredibly popular. They were so much less expensive than getting a picture painted. So it was attractive for the middle class. You can get your portrait taken and not have to pay a fortune for a portrait artist, a painter, to sit there and paint your picture. You can go to one of these portrait studios that were popping up quite everywhere and pay an amount and sit down, get a picture taken of your family. So despite its inability to replicate copies, like the Talbot process, which was able to make copies from, the daguerreotype produced only one of a kind images. But millions of daguerreotypes were produced through the 1850s. People loved it. They called them mirrors of truth. They reflected like a mirror when you looked at them, especially at different angles, like I was saying before. Here's a couple pictures of daguerreotypes. Of course, you can't see that mirror-like effect here in the photograph. Daguerreotypes were used and sold a lot of miniatures. They were small little pocket-sized pictures that people can carry around with their loved ones. Here's an example of a folder that kept a daguerreotype that somebody might keep in a pocket or a purse. And you can see here there was a couple, there was a piece of glass, then they had maybe like a round mat around the picture. Then you see in the third row in, that would have been the actual piece of a daguerreotype, metal material. And then maybe a little metal border, which was then all secured into this little folding picture frame. Question is, how could an image be recorded that is as sharp and clear as a daguerreotype on that metal sheet, but a negative that you can make more than one print from rather than a positive? The Talbot process created a negative, but it wasn't as sharp. So now we're going to touch base on wet collodion process. We're going to talk more about this in a week or two. This process was created by Frederick Scott Archer. He made glass negatives, ambrotypes and tintypes. Ambrotypes are another form of glass negative, and a tintype is a metal negative. By 1860, the wet collodion process became the most popular process for photography. Because it was inexpensive, it required a few seconds for exposure, and it could be used to create images, negatives, for more than one duplicate. So you can make more than one picture from one negative. So before this, if you wanted a portrait of your family, you had to sit very still for a long period of time. We'll talk more about this in another presentation, but you had to support yourself, and that's why people looked stiff, and that's probably why they did not smile, because when you smile, you tend to shake your mouth and it would look blurry in the photograph. So the drawback to this wet collodion process was that the photographic material had to be coated, sensitized, exposed, and developed within 15 minutes of taking the photo. You couldn't take the photo and then wait a day or so. So people needed a portable darkroom when taking these photographs. So here's a photograph of one of those developing darkrooms, those portable darkrooms. It's a photographic van by Matthew Brady. And this is from the Civil War, 1863. So they would take a photo, run into this wagon, and through chemical process, develop it. Here we have a photograph of Abraham Lincoln outside of a tent here, discussing possibly the war, something. So photography is constantly evolving. They're trying to think of different, fun, unique ways to view things, more realistically, etc. So here we have a stereoscope from the 1850s. It's a device for viewing a pair of separate images, one for the left eye and one for the right eye. Two slightly different views of the same scene. So when these two nearly identical images taken just a few inches apart are looked at side by side through this viewer, it creates more of a three-dimensional image. This is the first 3D viewer. So this leads us to the question, is there a way to make multiple photographs at once to capitalize on that? Instead of making a negative and then producing positives from it, some photographers questioned, what can we do to make this simpler? So Desideri is credited with the introduction of this format of portraiture, where it uses a camera with multiple lenses that can photograph about 8 different poses on one large negative, saving money, saving time. So here we see the camera right here with 4 different lenses, and now we see an example here of the images taken. Right? It's different poses, slightly different poses. The person is moving. So this allowed photography even more readily available for the masses. It created very affordable portraits, served for visiting cards for friends and family. Now you can give a friend or a family member a picture of you. It was very popular during the Civil War to raise money for abolitionists. So here we see the joining of photography and video. This is the start of that. Edward Muybridge in 1878, he uses that multiple lens camera setup, but in a different way. He uses a row of cameras with tripwires to make a high-speed photographic analysis of a galloping horse. So each picture is taken in less than 2,000th of a second. All right, so a very rapid sequence. So that meaning 25 per second were able to be taken images. Now this is The Horse in Motion in 1878. There's a rumor saying that this was taken, or this was conceived, because Muybridge and his colleagues had a bet going. Some of them were saying that when the horse is galloping, all of his feet at some point are completely off the ground, and some other people said, no, that's not true. There's always one foot on the ground. So this set of photographs was the deciding factor. It proved what Muybridge thought was true, that all four legs were off the ground at one point in the image. All right, so now we're going to use those images from Muybridge, those separate images that are of the horse galloping, and put them together. It makes a zoetrope. Now this zoetrope here is the first small real-time movie. It can be viewed by a device such as what we see here. This is what it looked like. It was a bunch of images, like Muybridge's horses galloping, all around a circular device. Now, when the circular device was spun, kind of like a record, and you look through one of these openings, you would see the horses galloping. So photography up until this point is still produced by skilled professionals, photographers that were trained for that. How to mix chemicals, how to apply it to the glass negatives, the tin negatives, etc. But how do we make photography possible for everyone? That's what we're going to head into in this part of the presentation. So we're going to talk about the gelatin silver process in 1871. Now this was created and introduced by Richard Matto. Now Richard Matto creates a suspension of silver gelatin on glass plates. And then he gets to eventually make it on a flexible plastic film, which what we call today is cellulose. Now, when you're doing this, you don't have to process them immediately. His chemicals, as long as they were not exposed to light, could be stored and then printed at a later time or developed at a later time. Gelatin silver printing became the dominant photographic process from the 1880s to the 1960s. So these silver-based chemicals that were coated onto paper were easier to use in the wet collodion process, produced better results, and eventually factories started making paper that was pre-coated. So photographers didn't have to mix a chemical, spread it on the paper themselves, and let it dry. They could buy paper that's pre-coated and dried, ready to go for them. So now we're going into the Kodak era. We're going to talk about George Eastman in 1854 to 1932. He invented the roll plastic film, cellulose film, in 1885, and he founded Kodak. So that's what we know today, that those sheets, those rolls of film that we used to use as photographers. Portable, um, flexible film. So portable cameras is what is able to get photography to the average person. So in 1888 here, we have the first Kodak N1 box camera. It's the first marketed easy-to-use camera. It's introduced with the slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." So in this camera here, you would have on the opposite side of where the opening is most likely it wasn't small 35 millimeter film, especially in here, as we can see. It was a little bit larger film, but there was film on the opposite side. Whether it was a sheet, it's like some of the cameras had, one sheet at a time, or a roll of film. You can take that, you can either develop yourself, but what Kodak was wanting was you to send it back to them or bring it to their store and they'll develop it for you. So now anyone could take a photograph of anything. They can bring their more portable camera, which really wasn't that portable. If you look at that camera that we just looked at maybe was 4 inches, 5 inches by 6, maybe 8 inches. So yeah, it's not pocket size, but it was more easily transportable than previous cameras that were maybe 5 by 7 inch negative producers or 8 by 10 inch negative cameras that were very, very large and had to be on a large wooden tripod. So here's another example of a portable camera. This is the Kodak Brownie, maybe you've heard of it, from about 1900. This is a very inexpensive camera that was reloadable from the user. So the user could take the film out of the camera, drop it off someplace, and pick up their prints afterwards. This was used with a little bit of a bigger roll of film, 120 film. Here's a couple of pictures of advertisements for these cameras. They're fun to look at. The Kodak camera here on the left, you press the button, we do the rest, or you can do it yourself. The only camera that anybody can use without instructions. Just click the shutter and we'll develop your pictures for you. On the right, we have that Brownie camera and the price of it. Not a bad deal. So up until this point, all photographs were pretty much taken in daylight, in bright sunlight. But how do we create photographs in darker areas? People are going, wanted to take pictures of families indoors, wanted to take pictures of experiences indoors. How did they go about that? It was too dark. Nothing came out when they tried. So flash photography started. It was the burning of a chemical magnesium ribbon. It started in 1859. So if you see old movies and somebody's holding up this large thing and then they light it, they have a clicker and they light it and a big flash of light is exposed. That's what I'm talking about right here, okay? Flash powder of the 1880s was this mixture of this magnesium powder and potassium chloride. It was on a flash lamp, okay? And eventually they developed a non-explosive flash, which was developed in 1905, which was used up into the 1920s. So it wasn't as smoky and scary as that original chemical flash powder, kind of like a gunshot of a light that people were producing. So now we're getting into the early 1920s. We have Harold Egerton. He invents a xenon flash lamp, which can be used multiple times. It's not that flash gunpowder-like substance that was used before it. And he's able to achieve a flash duration of 10 microseconds, which is able to capture images like what we're looking at here. A milk droplet, okay, that's splattering. Look how beautiful that becomes. It becomes kind of like a crown, right? Right, so before this modern era of people now taking their own pictures, that Kodak Brownie camera, um, people were taking pictures with very large cameras. This wet collodion process, that Talbot daguerreotype processes, they were taken with large 5x7, 8x10 inch producing cameras, which were probably about maybe 12 inches by 15 inches or even bigger. Okay, and when you look at old movies of old photographers taking pictures, they're looking at the back of the camera with a black sheet over their head so they can see the image on a piece of glass in front of them and see if they like it or they don't like it, and then put the negative behind it or the plate behind it, the metal plate to be exposed. Um, but how can somebody take high quality photographs without having to use that equipment, that large camera? Because the Brownie cameras, those smaller type of cameras, you can get decent images, but they weren't of the best quality. So now we're going to touch base on getting towards the present day, a 35mm camera. In 1925, the Leica is introducing the 35mm format still photography. So those sheets of negatives that George Eastman, the Kodak company, were producing um, are now smaller. They're 35 millimeters wide. They're on flexible cellulose. Um, it's in a cartridge. You can easily pop in and out of your camera. So this smaller film type in these 35mm cameras with adjustable lenses, etc., captured decisive moments. Here we have a very famous photograph by Bresson in 1932, someone jumping, running through a puddle. On the right, we have Robert Capa of D-Day in 1944, taken with a Leica camera, which is a small, portable 35mm film camera. So now let's talk about color photography. The introduction of Kodachrome. Kodachrome film made by Kodak, which is a multi-layered color reversal film. All right, now this is the first foray into the color processes. So Kodachrome is slide film. Now, if you don't know what slide film is, it is a positive image produced onto that soft cellulose type film. Now, slide film was the first foray into color photography, but you can only view slide images through a viewer, like through a projector. So if you watch some old movies of people looking at photographs from trips and vacations in color, they were on a projector, right? And they're projecting onto a wall or a white sheet, etc. But can we make a color print? Can we make color images in other ways than that small slide that we're projecting onto a wall? We're jumping to 1942, the first color prints, Kodacolor prints. It's the first color film that yields negatives for making chromogenic color prints on paper. Chromogenic means the color wheel on paper. So all different colors on your film and onto paper. Color prints from negatives could be made for everyday consumers as opposed to being just projected from slides. Unfortunately, color film and color prints fade a little bit more easily than the black and white gelatin silver process. And you can see that here in these images, how the color is a little bit distorted, etc., from these images from the 1950s. So what if we want to see a print instantaneously now? We have black and white prints. We have, portable daguerreotypes that you can put in your pocket of your loved ones. We then have color slides that we can project onto a wall of our trip to Niagara Falls. Then we have Kodacolor prints, colored prints that we are able to put on our wall in frames. But people want instant now. So I want to be able to take a photo and make it up on a piece of paper instantly. Here we have a Polaroid. In 1948, Polaroid comes out. Edwin H. Land introduces the first Polaroid instant camera. It changed the entire landscape of consumer photography. By the 1960s, Polaroid was incredibly popular, and they released their first color camera in 1972. So here we have the Polaroid Land camera, 1949, which was a black and white camera, and you loaded the sheets of instant paper in the back. Here we have the very popular Color XX70 from 1972 to produce color images. Here's a couple fun Polaroids that were taken here in 1949 and 1950. We have a photographer with a much smaller reusable flash bulb on the left here, taking a portrait of a woman. And then we have on the right a picture of a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant. Here's just a couple more examples of what Polaroid cameras had looked like, the snapshots that it created on the bottom here. So Andy Warhol here, taking a picture with a Polaroid camera. Very popular image. He was one of the first artists to really capitalize on this instant technology. And we're going to see that in the next slide. He loved taking Polaroids. And in the 70s and 80s, he took tons of famous people. John Lennon, Debbie Harry, Basquiat here. So, very cool. All right, so now we're jumping to 1975, Steve Sasson. He's regarded now as the inventor of the digital camera, and he was working at Kodak Eastman at the time. So the first 8-pound camera recorded a 0.01 megapixel, which is nothing today because now we have 100 megapixel cameras or more. But he created these 0.01 black and white megapixel photos, and they were produced onto cassette tape, if you know what that is. It's a small little film-based tape that recorded images. The first photograph took 23 seconds to create, and to play back the images to view them, the data was read from that tape and displayed onto a television set. So here's some digital cameras that followed with this technology. Here we have a Kodak, an Olympus, and a Sony. So in 1990, these first digital cameras are available on the retail market. And in 1990, Adobe Photoshop is introduced. Impressive. So now we're looking at more modern, present day digital cameras. 35 millimeter. These are very high megapixels cameras compared to that first 0.01 megapixel camera. This Nikon D7000 that came out maybe 6 years ago. It's probably 12 to 16 megapixels. So the jump is incredible. And then you have the Nikon on the bottom here, same camera. There's a little different features on it. And you have two other high megapixel cameras pictured here as well. So we just went through a quick run through of the history of photography, which we're going to go in detail with throughout the rest of the semester. But now you can kind of get an idea of what we're learning about and where it kind of came from to where it is today. Look at these assorted lenses that we have to offer people today. On the top, these are the Nikon lenses. On the bottom, there's Canon's fleet of lenses. Impressive, and probably $1 million worth of lenses right here in this picture. We can't talk about digital photography without talking about the Hasselblad. The Hasselblad camera started as a film camera. It was used for many, many years, highly regarded by professional photographers, commercial photographers, wedding photographers, etc. Hasselblads were the strongest, most reliable film cameras. Basically, you can stand on a Hasselblad and not break it, drop it down a flight of stairs and not break it. They were made well. They were workhorses for photographers. Now, Hasselblad moved, along with everything else, to digital, and Hasselblad was one of the creators of the first large format digital cameras. So we had those cameras that we saw before. They were smaller formats. They were 35 millimeter format cameras. So that means a negative size of 35 millimeter sensors on the back of the camera that read the light that was being projected through the lens. These larger format Hasselblad cameras are kind of like those old-fashioned cameras that I was talking about, those large 8x10, 5x7 cameras of the past, where old-fashioned photographers put their head underneath those black sheets and took the photo. That's the amount of quality that you're getting, those larger pictures, but in a small digital camera compact environment. So we have what we basically use today as cameras now. The majority of the masses don't have cameras. We have our cell phones, and most people just use that. So in the 2000s, the J phone was created in Japan. It was the first commercially available mobile phone with an integrated camera that can take and share still pictures. Today, most Americans have a smartphone phone of some sort, and Instagram was developed in 2010, which has more than 500 million different people using this application, sharing photographs every month. So we've come a long way from one still photographed by Nietzsche through his house window that took days to create, to a cell phone that takes a million photos and we can upload to Instagram instantly. So we even have camera phones that have more than one lens in them, or these attachments that create different lens types, wide angle, telephoto, etc. And we'll talk about that in presentations. A wide angle photo obviously takes a wider view of the image in front of you. It covers more, so if you're taking a picture of a landscape, or telephoto lens, which makes a image zoomed in. So we're able to take something from far and make it look closer to the camera. So now we have present day. We have what digital photography has turned into. We have the merging of Photoshop and high resolution images to create one large composite of hundreds of photographs here and seamlessly make it look like it was taken all at the same time. Stephen Wilkes here, if you look him up, creates these beautiful pictures of nighttime into daytime of all different locations all over the world. So here's Coney Island from 2011, and we have this seamless integration from night to day on the boardwalk. Looks like it just happens instantly. It's beautiful, and it's such a high resolution image that you can blow this up to a billboard size. So because we're in this digital era right now, we have to talk about Instagram and the most liked photograph of all time, 10 million likes. Of Beyonce here. So we go from having one image at a time and maybe you're able to get a copy of it and give it a loved one, for them to keep in their pocket, to having photographs of celebrities and everybody instantly available onto our phones. So here we have Ben Lowy, who shoots commercially all with his iPhone. So we have a lot of photographers that are able to make money, create amazing images using their phones, whether it's for documentary work, for commercial work, etc. Here we have two different images, Libya in 2012, and then we have Hurricane Sandy from 2012 as well. So news photography, documentary photography has changed from using cameras and film to taking pictures with our phone and even making those images covers on Time magazine, as we can see this picture right here. Now we're going to talk about in future presentations photography and how it was not thought of art as an art form, and then fought for that title as art from photographers, and eventually, like we see here, Edward Steichen's photo of the pond from 1904 is artwork. It sold for $2.9 million in 2006. Here we have sold for $4.3 million in 2011. At the time, was the most expensive photograph ever sold by Gursky. And I'll show you more of his work towards the end of the class, the semester, end of the semester. But here's a color photograph here, 1999. $4.3 million is sold for.